Oh, okay.
Works. All right, X is here. Good, very good. Okay, it's live.
Hey, Tom. Hey, Declan. Hey, Ix. Haven't seen you guys since our last broadcast.
About 2 years ago.
Yeah. What have you guys been doing?
Not much, Joe. Good to talk to you, buddy.
You still a Calvinist? Because you were last time, like 2016, right?
Sorry about that. I had the YouTube feed open as well as this, and I was getting a really freaky echo. Forgot that happens.
Test, test. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
True.
Got a hat?
Yeah, so for the 9 people watching, all 9 of you, which is probably 5 of you because 4 of us have it open, we're going to be talking to SJ Thomason. I don't know much about her. I know that I saw her in a live hangout 2-3 days ago. She was talking about, I don't even know. But she just seemed like she was nice. She described herself as an apologist, which is kind of rare these days. And seemed to have an eagerness to engage with non-believers. So yeah, I just sent her a message and I was like, hey, you want to talk about stuff? I didn't even specify. There is no declared topic, no specified topic. So we're going to kind of feel it out. The only things that I know about her is that she's got kind of like she's interested in Jordan Peterson. I listened to a couple other of her hangouts, but beyond that, I just don't know much about her.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising to see someone who's into Jordan Peterson but isn't a cultural Christian. Because she also has like Kent Hovind on her stuff. So she's drawing from like all the way from Kent Hovind, 6,000 Years Old Earth, to Jordan Peterson, I Act as Though I Believe.
No, she's an old earther.
She is, yeah. Yeah, but she has Kent and another guy on to debate. So she's doing hangouts and videos from the whole cross section of Christian thought.
Well, we'll see.
She's teaching the controversy, let's put it that way.
Yeah, she seems to be very inclusive of many different interpretations and thinks that God is very loving to everyone.
Ix, did you see his 11 question or her 11 questions?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, but I can't answer those because I'm an atheist. Don't you realize that? Those are like total non-answerables.
Yeah. I can ask her about that too.
Yeah, I mean, if you were worried about a starter, that's it. That's what we could do. Just let's go through those questions.
Oh, man. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Who's all here? So I see it's a Declan and Exandria and Joe and Tom. So big group.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you. Can we call you Stephanie?
You may, sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I'm Tom, and I'm the one that contacted you. I just saw you on that Adam friended, what was it, stream, and just seems like you were just having an interesting conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, that was fun. I actually I like Adam Frienden's videos. So he's an atheist. I'm not. I'm a Christian, but I find him to be very interesting. He actually has a very interesting perspective on religion. A lot of anti-theist views. So it's interesting. I mean, he's against anti-theism, which is unusual, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, I noticed that Jordan Peterson slant that you both seem to have.
Yes, I like Jordan Peterson. In fact, I'm going to be on another hangout later on today to talk more about Jordan Peterson. So I like listening to him.
Well, that's interesting because Jordan Peterson, it seems like he really identifies as more of a cultural Christian, and I don't think that's the case with you.
No, I'm not. That's where we differ. In his particular case, he's actually investigated Christianity. He said he was going to spend a few years looking into Jesus. In my case, I sort of rediscovered my faith about 7 years ago, and so I'm full on born again Christian. So I'm different than him in that way.
Yeah, he actually describes it as something along the lines of he acts as if God were real or something, which is pretty consistent with his definition of metaphorical truth, a la Brett Weinstein, which entails the proposition being false. So, so the whole thing is very perplexing to me.
Yeah, I think nailing Peterson down on exactly what his beliefs are with respect to Christianity is easier. I mean, see, it would be easier to probably try to hammer Jello into a wall than to get him to fully explain it. Because I've had to watch many videos to get that out of. I mean, to finally discover that. I didn't. He's not terribly forthcoming about that, I don't think.
What's confusing about the concept being the underlying of the Western ethos, that God is the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. That isn't all. It confronts chaos of being itself, generates habitable order. It's a medical physical proposition that's conceptualized, and so on and so forth. I mean, he's got a 15-minute answer, which he said he wrote down. So that's the one that he thought out carefully, that he definitely wanted to say, not one that just kind of came to him in the moment.
Yeah, it's funny when you said that, because I think I've heard him say that exact same speech. I was listening to, and it's almost like if you had that little Kermit the Frog voice, I would have thought you were him.
Yeah, like if I asked you, Stephanie, do you believe in Jesus? What would you say?
Yes.
Right. So I've seen interviews with Jordan Peterson where he's asked that exact same question, and there's a long pause, and then he says, "What do you mean by Jesus?" You know, it's almost purposely obstructive.
Yeah, there's one video where he's said that he can't back up the idea that there's historical confirmation of Jesus's resurrection.
Ooh.
Yeah, see, if he did say that, I completely disagree with him. There's plenty of historical evidence, and in fact, there's a good reason why you can't go into any single university that's accredited in a decent university and find any professor who doesn't at least acknowledge that there was an historical Jesus. It's the fringe lunatics, I think, that are outside of the university who think that there was not a historical Jesus. I really don't. I would be really surprised if Jordan Peterson actually thought that there was not a man named Jesus.
The resurrection.
Okay, the resurrection. That's different. So you will find people who obviously. I mean, there's Muslims. There are people who don't believe Jesus resurrected. So I'll definitely give that to. If he thought that, then that's something that is
kind of juggling with some sort of metaphorical resurrection where he actually died, but like his spirit was resurrected. It all seems just really kooky.
Yeah. So are all four of you? Are you all atheists, or what's your positions?
I'm a former Christian. I was a Christian for 32 years. I'm now agnostic. I'm not really hostile towards Christian theism. I'm just at a place right now where I'm sort of questioning the truth of the proposition. So that's me personally.
Good.
I am a non-believer, Stephanie. I'm hostile to some aspects of religion, though.
Interesting.
Yes.
And
Sure.
you can call me Ix. Sorry about getting out of order, but I'm actually a community manager with the ACA, the Atheist Community of Austin. So I've gotten a little bit active in the atheist community, but it's a lot of fun because I get to learn from a lot of theists as well. It's a dialogue, being in a community, like having conversations like these, which I enjoy.
Did you see the frown on her face when you mentioned the ACA?
Because that, now, are you associated, is that an affiliation with the Atheist Experience?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the main shows, yeah, but there's others, Talk Heathen, secular sexuality, etc. Yeah.
Okay, because I had a disaster of a phone call 3 years ago.
Directly associated with one Matt Dillahunty.
I had a nightmare of a phone call with that man 3 years ago, and I would actually call. I would call into some of these things. I want to call Stefan Molyneux on his channel, and I'm afraid to because I don't know if it's going to go the way it went with Matt. I'm just not going to do it again. I'm going to subject myself to that. It was terrible.
I know almost anything about you, Stephanie, and when I did a little Google. And I saw one of the first thing came up was you on the Atheist Experience. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, let's watch it. And he was like, yeah, you were really
so horrible
vicious on Twitter before you called in. And I was like, oh, do I want to talk to this lady? She's just. And then
I was bad. I didn't, I had, the thing is I call him with this massive chip on my shoulder and he just knocked it right off. And then he hung up on me and I deserved it. And I listened to it, about 5 times after that. And each time I got bigger cringes on my face thinking, why did I do that? And so I waited probably 6 months before getting on any YouTube channels after that. I mean, I was completely in hiding.
Oh, wow. That shows that, you have some sort of self-reflection mechanism and you're able to at least objectively analyze that experience. And I think that's a good thing. That's surprising though.
It's also normal too. I think at least in my experience, no matter how smart you are, typically happens to everyone, at least in my experience. No matter what your IQ is or how smart you are, you're always going to find someone who has that knockdown, drag out argument against your position. So,
well, I didn't particularly think his argument was very good. That wasn't really the issue. The issue is I was acting like a pompous fool, and he hung up on me, and I deserved it. And so, his responses. I actually wrote a blog on his responses and how a lot of them were actually fallacious. And so I did that. It's actually one of my most visited blogs on my blog site. I've had probably about 10,000 people who've looked at it. So it's a pretty popular blog, but it's reflecting again, I go back on it and I just need to listen to it. And I talk to my husband about it, talk to my sister, other people who saw it, and they agreed I sound like a pompous fool. So I just not going to do that again. So
the question is, do you believe that you were committing the argument from ignorance fallacy?
Yes, I was. I was committing that. So that was my bad. I at the time, and there was another thing that we talked about in that thing that I'm very familiar with Wikipedia, but I didn't answer him properly on that. I teach classes and tell my students never to use Wiki or I'll mark them down. So I'm really familiar with Wiki, and it's so that was another little part of that. But yes, I made that was part of my problem, was the argument from ignorance. But it also, one of the big issues with that particular thing is when you look at all of the facts surrounding Jesus's resurrection, and I say facts because I should just say maybe scholarly consensus on many of the different issues that occurred, such as the apostles and the way they acted later. And that was what I was talking about with Matt. And when you look at all of that kind of stuff and you come up with the best explanation for all of these different things that occurred and what people agree upon, the best one actually speaks to Jesus having resurrected. So that was an argument that now since then I've gotten on lots of channels. I've been on Godless Engineer's channel, Paulogia. I was with him on the Non Sequitur show, and I've actually debated that exact topic that I just mentioned. So I'm very interested in talking about that kind of stuff and trying to show people the light, if you will. So, but my approach was horrible with Matt. So if I could even apologize to him. It's so bad, but now he's got me blocked on Twitter, so I won't be able to do that. But
yeah, you're referring to the minimal facts argument. I hate that argument.
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, that seems reasonable that you wouldn't like it.
You're saying the best explanation.
So that's it. Hey, so let's break the ice, and I'm gonna throw you a softball, Stephanie. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. How about let's see. I got a list here. Does God heal amputees?
Well, we have evidence in the Bible of some people being healed, so there's a chance.
In today's world?
I haven't seen anybody in today's world being healed. No. So it's so obviously it's, I mean, it's not something that a church person's going to do. Go touch somebody and their arm grows back or something. That's not going to happen. So.
But you think miracles happen?
I do. Yes, I do think miracles happen.
Right. So why do you think that a miracle like cancer would be healed, but not the restoration of someone's arm?
Oh, well, I guess it just depends on see, I think one of the things is that we have to look at is that God is sovereign, and he obviously has structured the planet in such a way that there are certain things that we can heal, medicine can heal, and there are other things that can't be healed through us and through our medicine. And so just one of those things that can't be healed at this point is the idea of an amputee. But there is a potential that down the road with some of the stem cell research people have been doing that will eventually be able to have that capability. So, but that's not saying whether or not God, is promoting that or anything like that. It's just saying that I would say, if I had to answer that, it's possible that God could do that if God wanted to heal an amputee. It just seems that we have no evidence that I know of in these days that he has healed any amputees.
Tom, do you mind if I follow up, or did you have a...
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, well, I mean, looking at it from like the agnostic or the atheist position, do you not see how it would be a little odd, or at least affirming for the agnostic or the atheistic position, if the way by which a Christian or a theist would be to verify their position was to say that it was done by miracles, and yet the miracle that's supposedly happening from the Christian God is not one that can necessarily be viewed or provided an analysis for.
So yes, I guess you have to see, why do people come to religion? Why did somebody like me come back to religion? I'll tell you how I came, and it's, of course, it's going to be something that you won't be able to verify, but I'll tell you that it's changed my life. I was raised in the Catholic Church. I got very frustrated with the Catholic Church. By about my 20s, I just walked away, and I actually started making fun of people going to church on Sundays. I was actively doing that. I was actually hostile towards the church. I got upset because I didn't like how these priests, and it's still going on, how these priests have been getting away with the kind of actions that they've done on, violating children. So that made me very upset, made my family very upset. We all left except for my sister. And I was gone for about 20 years, just floundering about and being a non-Christian pretty much. I mean, I was sort of a Christian in name, maybe like a Jordan Peterson Christian. I really doubted that Jesus resurrected. I started thinking that the Buddhist religion was superior. So I started reading books from Eastern religions, and I just started looking at that whole idea. And then about 7 years ago, I started having some very significant spiritual experiences where I couldn't deny God anymore, and I couldn't deny Jesus anymore. And the more I studied and the more I learned after those experiences, the more solid my foundation for my faith became. Mm-hmm. So I feel, yes, I was brought back because I had miracles in my own life. Like one of the examples is I actually heard God speak to me one time. Now, this is one time. Mm-hmm. And in this time, he instructed me on something that I was doing wrong. He corrected me. He showed me a vision in in this interaction where I could see people in my life who are very important and whom I should value. And I did a 180. I changed my mind on something. He talked me out into it. And I'd say within 6 months, I started to realize that was the best thing I could have possibly ever done. And so he is very much in our lives if we want him to be.
Well, right. And I totally understand that. I had the same sentiment when I was a Christian. But what I was really concerned with, though, is, and I may not have said this as clearly as I'd aimed to, there's a claim that there are miracles that God does. But it seems, and this is more to what Tom was talking about, it seems that the miracles that supposedly God does are ones that are not openly able to be viewed, right? So, for example, I don't know what your position is on the Word of Faith movement. If you're a Protestant, you're probably not a big fan of them, but you believe apparently that God heals things like cancer or maybe a mental disability. But when it comes to what we would expect to see, if in fact this God was involved in the world, are things that are not happening, such as like healed amputees. We don't see people praying, and then suddenly their arms or their legs are growing back. And that seems to be something that we would expect to see if in fact the hypothesis was true, which was that a God exists, which is interested in intervening in a world in a specific context, which would be in fact providing healings for people.
See, I wouldn't say that we would expect to see that. I definitely don't think that we would necessarily expect to see an amputee be healed. It's what I expect to see. If I were wondering if our world is being run or being watched basically by an objective moral lawgiver, is I would look to see if we have objective moral duties. And in fact, we do have objective moral duties. And people have discovered that our objective moral duties, no matter what culture we come from, and no matter what walk of life we're in, everyone who's been surveyed in thousands and thousands of people, and this is even from atheists like Jonathan Haidt, he found that the number one variable that impacts people is the idea of care and harm. Other people like Shalom Schwartz have also indicated in his 2012 study that everyone knows they ought to be benevolent. Another study out of Kinnear in 2000 basically said that everyone knows we ought to follow the golden rule. So if I'm going to be, if I were making the assertion that the world is being managed or watched over by a moral Lord who's benevolent, I would look to see those values and those duties to be being prevalent in the world and being transcendent to cultures and people. And so the only way to explain a transcendent moral system, the one in which we live in, to me, that makes sense is looking at the fact that we're being managed by a divine moral lawgiver who's intentional.
Right. Well, I mean, and that could definitely be something that we could talk about. But right now, I'm sort of wondering why you wouldn't expect to see some form of outright opened healing, given that you in fact do believe that Yahweh heals. I mean, so. For example, if there's tons of ways to go about this, right? If the God that exists is omnibenevolent, if the God that exists is interested in converting people, if the God that exists is interested in a good portion, if not all, even some, to come to the truth and saving grace of Jesus Christ, it absolutely seems to me to be the case that one of the things that we might see if he heals or intervenes in that context would in fact be something like healing limbs or, just pick your poison. Someone's nose is broken. Someone prays for it. It's healed. As you stated before, right, there are plenty of instances in Scripture where men were cured of blindness, these sorts of things, and we don't seem to see those today.
Well, I think that, I think you've picked something that you thought to yourself, okay, I'm going to find something that I can pose to a Christian, that's something that is out there in the world that we haven't seen be healed, to propose that must mean there's no God. I don't think it follows. I think that what you're proposing, I think you're not looking at all of the other ways in which people are healed. And one of those ways is the insides, the emotions of people. And one of the ways to heal people and is to call on God. And a lot of times he can change you as a person. I don't think God's big concern is whether or not we have an arm. I think his big concern is whether or not we have the inner desire to seek him out. And he goes in and he cleans house with us. That's what he does.
Just to be really clear, Stephanie, that was never, ever the argument that was made.
That's right.
Never did anyone ever say that because God doesn't heal, because amputees aren't healed, there's no God. That's not our position. You could still have a God who didn't heal amputees. The question was, why doesn't he?
Because I think you have to realize that God is sovereign. And so God makes, he knows how best, he knows how to position us in the best way possible to get us to him eventually. And in some cases, that means we're born in one country or we're born in a different country. We're born with a different set of challenges, and it's all kind of structured around what we need spiritually to grow. And so he's not trying to heal us physically so much as spiritually. And that's basically what he does. And I'm a living example of a very flawed person who's got God has worked through. So, there are others like me. There's actually, 93% of the planet believes in a God or gods. And that's a pretty interesting thing if you posit that there's absolutely no God or gods, but somehow 93% of people actually don't agree with you.
And surely what follows from that, though?
I'm just pointing out that there's a very large group of people who feel that it makes a lot of sense to actually question our inner spirituality and our purpose and our meaning. And if you actually do that in depth,
follows from that, right? We can't make any conclusions on the truth value of the proposition, right? Well, I'll help you out here, Stephanie.
I guess I'm trying to. I guess I'm just trying to tell, because
So you don't want to say that.
Wait, say it again. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's a textbook ad populum fallacy. So you don't want to say that. I mean, I just think maybe you want to say that.
No, I know it's. I know an atheists love to talk about fallacies and that kind of thing, and I know that. But that's. I was just pointing out that there's a lot of people who think that there's a consensus view essentially, and so the probability that people are going to believe in God when they're born in this planet is pretty high. So if we just talk about sheer probabilities, we could look at that. Now, that doesn't speak to the fact that Christians make up one portion that's pretty small, relatively speaking. So, we make up about 2 billion out of about 8 billion people on the planet. So, so that's only a quarter. So that I'm not speaking to the truth of Christianity in that argument, but I was just saying we're hardwired to believe in God, and they've actually done a lot of studies to show that.
Can I
hardwired to seek pattern and meaning, and it all kind of connects.
Tom, do you mind if I follow up on that real quick?
Go ahead.
Yeah, all I was going to say is, I thought a lot about this as a former Christian. What I think is interesting is that what's interesting is that if you take the amount of people who might in fact be theist, but are in fact of what would be called from each sect the chosen or the correct rather sect of Christian theism that would be the necessary precondition for them to end up going to heaven or to be saved, it's extremely small. You may have a bunch of theists, right? But you got to remember, Jehovah's Witnesses count themselves as theists. Catholics count themselves as theists. Muslims count themselves as theists. And all three of them believe that all other three of those sects are in fact going to be damned for eternity. So if you're making an argument that somehow we're hardwired in order to believe in a God, it's not saying much if the necessary precondition of being saved is not just that you're a theist.
No, speaking as a former Catholic, we never had the belief that the other people were all going to go to hell. So that I'll just correct you on that. As far as
are you currently a Protestant? Just out of curiosity.
I'm a Baptist now, but I was raised in the Catholic Church. I went to Catholic grade schools, Catholic high school for my first year. So I'm very familiar with what the Catholics teach. We never said that about any other Christian sect. I would never say that about another Christian sect. In fact, I feel like there's many doors that can lead to Jesus, and it could be through a Baptist door, or it could be through a Protestant door, different Protestant denominations door. But actually, let me just say something. In the Bible, it just makes clear that faith is really key. And so the whole idea, if people only believed in one simple verse, which is John 3:16, I think I'd make the argument that's going to serve them really well.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
Let me just go back real quick to something that you said about objective morality, because I happened upon like a blog post where you talked about that. And I think your argument was something like, relative morality or cultural morality cannot be the case, because if that were the case, Nazi Germany would not have had people that condoned that behavior at that time. Do you remember? Can
I build on that? Because actually, since that time, since I published that blog, now I've been working on an academic article. So I've actually written quite a bit and studied quite a bit since that blog.
Okay.
So I'll make the argument. Yeah, I'd like to clarify my argument. So I'll make the argument now, after studying as much as I have,
okay.
that you know, we have both relative morality and objective morality. So we have objective moral duties to do the right thing. We have moral oughts to, and we all happen to know what's right or wrong, whether or not people actually care about what's right or wrong or want to act on that. But we all have that hardwired within us as a moral compass. But, you know, relatively speaking, we're also influenced by cultures. And we're also like, I'm influenced here as an American. I'm very likely to have pretty high scores in things like hedonism and achievement striving from the Schwartz Value Survey. And that's a cultural thing. And but I happen to also know from the same exact Schwartz's surveys of thousands and thousands of people that even though Americans actually score extremely high on what they call self-enhancement values, and even though my chances or the probability of me being large in self-enhancement, I actually know that, and all of us know, according to Schwartz, that benevolence is more important. So self-transcendence is something that's a superior value. So the is and the ought are distinguished. And so what I'm trying to say is, if relatively speaking, I mean, I would say that the argument to just be a moral relativist is a problem. To me, you need to be a combination of a person who understands the cultural influences, but also just maybe the natural, human, innate, global influence, if you want to call it, and our intuitions. And I could even take what I follow now as a combination of both consequentialism and deontology. So I think when you take the two together, you look at moral reasoning and you look at moral intuitions, and you take the whole package and you just also analyze where that all came from. And so I'm, again, making that argument that it came from a moral lawgiver.
Right. So when I saw that argument, it immediately struck me as being flawed, because you can just make the same exact case in reverse for like evolutionary morality or something like that. You could say something like, I know that objective morality is not the case, because if it were, then people wouldn't have done what they did in Nazi Germany, right? It just seems flawed.
Well, no, it's Nazi Germany is an excellent textbook example of when people.
Morality, but if they had this intrinsic morality implanted in each individual, then things like that would not have happened.
I think that what happened was a lot of the Nazis, the ones who actually fought in that war, a lot of those people, and some of the ones who didn't, you know, they weren't involved in the death camps and that kind of thing, but they were fighting in that war against, maybe they were on French soil fighting against Americans or something like that. A lot of those people came to regret what they did. And I know that I have German relatives who actually fought on the wrong side. So I know the way that the German pulse was on that, and they're very upset with, you know, they're not alive anymore, but they were very upset in years to come over their role when they found out about the concentration camps. So
can I ask you?
Do you mind if I ask a question? Because I came in. Is the idea that you've accepted that you're giving a form of moral relativism, right? That's what I came in on, because what you described sounds like moral relativism. But you think it's distinct from other forms of moral relativism?
No, I think, and I think I want to go back to the evolutionary question too, but I think the idea with moral relativism is, I'm just saying that people, we're more complex than being as simple as relativism is. If we're just looking at being only moral relativists, then there's a problem. We actually have lots of evidence that there's objective moral duties that actually guide humanity. So multiple studies, I could even point out the Globe studies, the World Value Surveys. There are many places you can go and find out that there are objective moral duties. Now, science and evolution, that does a great job in explaining descriptively how we are. It does a good job at even explaining our biological predispositions to be certain ways. For example, I'm about half, you know, of my personality traits are explained by my parents, and that's with everybody. I've seen studies on that too. So we know that the personality traits, good and bad, are explained through our biological evolution. What we don't understand from biology and biological evolution is moral duties. Biology, again, is descriptive and not prescriptive. So Stephanie, we don't have a good handle on our moral duties.
So the issue here is, I still don't understand how you're identifying the moral objectivity part, right? What's called moral. Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Seems like she's trying to say universal, Joe.
Yeah, universal is another way to say it. So it's universal moral values that people share.
Right.
And it's what it means is it's not subject, like it's not our moral duty to follow the golden rule is not something that is subject to your opinion of it. In other words, it's something that transcends humans. So it transcends populations.
And so what are you using the two interchangeably?
I'm as far as universal, I'd make an argument. In fact, I'd like to use that. Primarily use objective, actually, just when I'm speaking on this. So I usually don't say universal, but
right, because if everyone just thought that it was cool to punch babies, you wouldn't say that's objectively moral. So we agree with you that there are a lot of behaviors that appear to be universal that are shared by almost everyone. Now the question is, really, what do you mean by objective? So now you're going to get into sort of what does it mean for something to be good, Euthyphro Dilemma type thing. I don't know. What's your position on that?
The Euthyphro is actually a false dichotomy. So the problem with the Euthyphro dilemma, and that's the idea that you have two people saying, one person says, is something pious because God wills it to be pious, or is it pious, or is it or does God will it because it is pious, something like that. So the idea is God is the standard of morality. So God is the objective moral standard against which we judge whether or not something is pious. So it's a false dichotomy that forces people into two positions when there's actually a third one that should be addressed.
Yeah, but the third one is just appealing to his nature. And that just means that, I mean, what's good about that? You're just saying that this person is this guy, so therefore he's good.
I think if you look at the way that humanity is structured, so the whole world basically knows that we have moral oughts to do what's good, what actually is right. What's just, what's fair, all those kind of things. When you look at that, we have these duties to be caring and loving and kind and help people, help nature, help animals. We have all that kind of stuff in us. And it speaks to the fact that our guider, the person who has been guiding us, also must have those values. It follows that it would be consistent with his nature, that's what our nature is directed towards.
But it seems like those things that you would point to, which you say is good, still are only good in virtue of the fact that they are in accordance with God's nature. But if I'm to ask you, why is God's nature good? You're going to refer back to the same things that you referred to before to say that it's good. It seems like it's circular and also tautological.
Let me explain how. I think, if you just look at the example of Jesus Christ, I think that if we want to know what God's nature is and how God would like us to act, the best people on the planet are the ones who actually try to emulate him the most. As far as I mean, there are some people that are really good, that might be really good Hindus or really good Buddhists. So I guess I shouldn't say that, but I'll say many really good people on this planet have done a wonderful job of emulating the kinds of behaviors that Jesus exemplified. So I think that if you say, when we wonder what's God's nature like, I think just looking at the example of Jesus gives us a really good idea.
Right. Yeah, of course. I don't think anyone saying that we're granting scripture for the sake of argument, I don't think anyone is disagreeing with the fact that if Christian theism is true, we could look at Christ and he would see how God acts. But the question is, how is the concept of goodness, if you ground it in God, not tautological at that point? Because I asked it's just, in other words, it's just ultimately kicking the can down the road from the Euthyphro Dilemma, right? If I say God's nature is good in virtue of what, and you say, well, nothing, I'm going to say, well, what reason is there to accept that God's nature is good? And then if you point to something outside of himself, such as the things that you mentioned before with regard to the air quotes good things that humanity does, I'm going to ask you, though, if those are good in virtue of what, and you're going to say God's nature. It's completely tautological.
Well, what I'm trying to do is try to redirect the conversation a little bit, just to focus on our example of God's nature, and that's Jesus Christ. And so I could posit it all the time. Obviously, I've never met God. I mean, no one's met, as far as the Father. So no one's met the Father. So the idea is we've seen his example in Jesus Christ. And so if we want to know exactly how God is and what his nature is like, we just look to Jesus. So,
well, again, I mean, if you want to get off this is fine. I've never heard, since I became agnostic, I've never heard a Christian be able to answer this. And it's actually one of the main reasons why I became agnostic, right? And the reason why is because if in fact we can't know what good means, and good means God's nature, and God says he's good, then the entire pillar by which scripture is written on crumbles, because the necessary precondition of the truth of scripture, at least from the perspective of God, is that he is good. But I'm not sure what that means if goodness, according to his own character and nature, is tautological.
See, I don't see goodness as being tautological. Again, and I don't want to keep going back on this, but I think that we can just, if we want to know how God acts and how God is in certain situations, or how we should be, we can just go back to Jesus. And a lot of people say, well, geez, that's only 2,000 years ago. And, why did Jesus wait so long? And what about all the people who were around before that? And that's a big argument from some people. But it's interesting to note that the Population Reference Bureau has indicated that 57% of the global population of 108 billion people came about after Jesus, which is pretty fantastic, really. So, what I'm just trying to say is if we want to look at God's nature and we're curious to know about God's nature, the Bible, which is the most well-read book in the entire planet, gives us a really good indication of how he is, and Jesus gives us a great example of how we should live. Now, I live?
Yeah,
right? I'm certainly flawed. I just point that out. But
what Declan is trying to say is that when you say God is good, in virtue of his nature, the tautology is as follows. You're simply saying God is God. That's the problem.
See, I don't see that as a problem. I'm saying, I would say that God is the moral standard against which we judge morals. There's a reason why all of humanity is directed to do what's right. There's a reason why we define what's right as focusing on things like equity and equality and caring. And that is because it comes from our moral lawgiver who's directing us.
But that is hashed out in God's nature, right?
I think we're all formed in the image of God. So yes, we're a part of God's nature as well.
No, the standard in which it's hashed out is God's nature, right? It's not based on either horn. You were saying that it's based on his nature,
Correct.
What's good is in accord with God's nature, right? God's nature is going to be God. Your nature is going to be Stephanie. So when you say God is good, you're saying God is God. It's a tautology. It's vacuous.
If that is what brought you away from, is that actually seriously what brought you away? That argument brought you from God?
Yeah, let me explain to you.
I don't think that's a very good reason to leave God for that reason.
Well, let's find out. If all of Scripture is predicated, if God ought to be worshipped partially because he is good, but the term good describing God is vacuous, explained as under Christian theism, then what rational reason do I have to say that God is good? Because good doesn't mean anything. That's like me saying God is blah, blah.
I think, again, if you want to, I think we should probably get off this point, because I feel like we're beating dead horses here. But again, if you want to see what it means for God to be good, look at the example of Jesus Christ.
Do you mind if I ask a question that's related to what you just said, instead of trying to say tautology 50 times, like these guys for some reason, right? You keep on appealing to Jesus's moral character as like a guide for how we should be moral, right? And you could frame the issue that's been pointed out with the Euthyphro Dilemma using that idea of Jesus, which is look, you can just ask, does Jesus have reasons for doing these morally good things as opposed to doing morally bad things, right? And immediately you realize it's a problem if you just say, yeah, his reasons are, it's his nature. Just like it would be a problem to say, yeah, the reason why this is wrong is because it just matches God's nature, right? You want to be able to say that Jesus has a good reason to do something that's right versus doing something that's wrong. But it doesn't seem like you really can, even if you do see Jesus as this model of moral conduct. You're going to have to appeal to reasons that are outside of his nature in order to justify why we should see him as a model of moral conduct.
Well, see, with as far as Jesus, what I would say is because he's sinless and his moral nature is perfection, his moral intuitions, everything about him was in perfection. And so I wouldn't use the reasoning argument. That's a consequentialist position. I would actually go to the deontological argument to look at Jesus and look at his intuitions, everything about him, the why he did what he did. All of it was just to exemplify moral perfection for us. There's a lot of theories on why Jesus came down and what happened. And one of the theories is essentially to show us how we should live.
But it seems like an issue if what you're saying is you can't really say that Jesus has a good reason to follow God's commands. It just comes down to his being sinless, his being perfect, because then you're just reducing it to his nature. And that runs into the problem of the is-ought gap.
It's, if we go back and we look at it, are we supposed to be the ones who figure out what Jesus's reasons are? And philosophers have been trying to study Jesus for centuries and trying to figure out exactly why he came, why did he have to die on the cross, why did all this stuff happen? And a lot of people form their own reasons. Some say it's, he wanted to exemplify for us what it means for ultimate love. He said the ultimate love essentially was dying for your brother or dying for your sister. So he said that, but then other people would say, well, no, maybe he came to pay sort of a ransom. So they look at ransom theory and where did the ransom go? And so, but we know that Satan wouldn't get that kind of power. So the next theory is, well, maybe he came because, he had to reconcile God's perfect justice with God's perfect mercy. And that's one of the things that he did on the cross. He actually, paid the price for humanity's sins and reconciled God's justice and God's mercy. So that's just another argument. So there are a lot of arguments for why Jesus did what he did and how we can sit and figure out what his reasoning is. But we really won't know until one day when we meet him.
Okay, so that's what I see as just a huge problem. If you agree with me that we shouldn't just reduce what is good to the nature of someone, for example, reduce what is good to Jesus just being a perfect person. And we should be concerned about the reasons for why you should do something that you consider right and that others might consider wrong. Now you're saying we just won't know until I guess you were implying until we go to heaven or something. But I see that as a huge problem. If you don't know the reasons why you ought follow God's commands, then how can you say that God in the Bible is the recipe for being a perfect moral person, or at least trying to be the perfect moral person? We can't know the reasons, or it's just reduced to Jesus.
Well, I'm not saying person. I totally don't. I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on a lot of the things that are why Christianity is what it is and why Jesus did what he did. I have my reasoning that I've accepted myself. I know that all four of you have rejected the reasoning that I've already accepted. So we're already on a us versus or we versus they kind of thing. And I don't want to be your enemy. I'd love it if you guys all found Jesus in some way. I probably don't see that happening in this conversation or anytime soon.
I don't think you're my enemy or anything. You seem really nice. It's really I like talking with you. I'm interested in those reasons that you have for being moral, right? Because the problem that was pointed out earlier is that if it's just reduced down to God's nature, or now we're talking about Jesus, if it's just reduced down to Jesus's nature, then it seems like it's just tautological. But if it's because Jesus has reasons for having these commands, commanding what's right and wrong, then it seems like those reasons are going to be based off of something outside of him, right? And you said that you do have a good handle on those reasons, but are you saying that you agree that those reasons are Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
When I listen to the Atheist Experience, and I have listened a few times even since then, when I listen to that show and I hear a question that's asked a lot, and I think it's actually a good question, so I did write a blog on it. But he always say, "Well, why did God kill God? You know, or why did this happen?" And it's actually a really good question, and it's very difficult for some Christians to answer that question. When they really think about it, they say, "Well, geez, why did Jesus have to die on the cross in that way? And why did God do it exactly this way?" And a lot of us try to look at this, and you know, then we get to the Bible and we start digging in and praying and trying to come up with the answer of why did God do that? And the basic answer is because only a sinless lamb, if you will, is actually capable of taking on the sins of the world. And so God is the standard of no sin. So even when Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A lot of people wonder why did that happen? It was because at that point, Jesus was filled of our sin. He had taken on the sin, and God is not consistent with that. God could not be with him at that point. So God basically was outside of him at that point, and that's why we heard that. So, but once he died on the cross and he redeemed us, and that was predicted quite nicely in Isaiah 53, 700 years before.
Can I talk about the Old Testament for a second?
Sure.
You sure can.
Okay, so I don't have your new paper, and I would love to see how you've reformulated it. And you mentioned that you've done more research since writing the original morality paper. But you start with establishing, you know, from a Kantian perspective, you know, the idea that there's multiple conceptions that people have tried to arrive at universal good, universal morality. And you mentioned that the value of truth is one of the foremost of those principles. And you mentioned that, you know, the case of the Nazis is a great example for how could you accept a moral system that would not, in principle, object to Nazism as being a deviation from what, if we have any duty at all, it would be not to find Jews and exterminate them or something, right? So you give the example of it's permissible to lie if you're defending, let's say, a Jew that's hiding in your house, because your duties to love, to equality, and to equity are overriding the duty of truth. And then you go on to say that we could have no means with which to judge the Nazi atrocities without our moral values being objective. And you say, we would have no means to judge the Canaanites, the Sodomites, or those living in Gomorrah either. We would be living in a world of moral calamity. Well, the judging of the Canaanites, the Sodomites, and Gomorrah is the justification in the Old Testament for the slaughter of all of those people. The Canaanites is particularly funny because the Hebrews are believed by scholars to have descended from the Canaanites who they supposedly slaughtered. Rather than being the victims of God's wrath, the Canaanites probably were the Hebrews historically, because that's not believed to be historically accurate. So if God's plan, and Jesus does cite it and say, you know, I come to fulfill the law. He's not discounting the Old Testament or the Mosaic law or the things that God does in the Old Testament. If your objective morality allows you to condemn Nazis in one sentence, and literally in the next sentence say we have to use this to judge the Canaanites, the Sodomites, and Gomorrah, and view God's wrath upon them and instruction of the Hebrews to kill them as moral, doesn't it strike you to, let's say, someone who's Kantian or has some other concept of universal morality, that your concept of universal morality deriving from a lawgiver actually equips you to commit genocide and believe in it the same way the Nazis did?
Yeah, so I disagree with a few of your points there. So one of your points that I'm going to disagree with is, well, one thing I'll agree with is actually there was hyperbole in the Old Testament. And so there's some examples of, for example, it's like when people go to play football now and they say, we slaughtered the other team. Well, it doesn't mean that they literally slaughtered everyone on the other team. It doesn't mean they even slaughtered them at all. It means that they beat them in the football game. So in the Old Testament, there are a lot of examples of hyperbole. And one of the examples is as if the entire Canaanite population was wiped out, because quite clearly it wasn't wiped out, and it keeps appearing later. More Canaanites appeared throughout the Old Testament after they claimed that they had gotten rid of them. But the other thing was, God didn't, in the example with the Canaanites, he actually told the Israelites to go in and drive them out. And so it was only the ones who decided, if there were ones who decided they were going to remain there, who went to battle against the Israelites when they came in there. So I just want to point to that. But as far as the idea of the objective morality in the basket that you're telling me, one thing I disagree with Kant. I read his book, and I disagree with him on the idea of he has our moral duties, but he looks at them in isolation. And I think it's important when we consider our objective moral duties to look at them in more of a group, like more of a basket of moral duties. So you ask yourself, what is the most caring solution? What is the most truthful solution? What is the best thing that's going to help my fellow human? You take all of that stuff together and you form your moral decisions on that point. So when I think we looked at the Nazis, and my example in there was, what was the right decision for someone who's hiding Jewish people in their home? And when a Nazi soldier shows up the door, what's the right decision to do? And all of us, you and I and everyone here in this conversation could agree that the best decision to make would be the one that's the most humane, and that's protect the people who are in the house by whatever means you have to use. And so the choice to lie to the soldiers, that would be morally acceptable in that particular case.
Can I respond to that real quick?
Can I say one quick response before you do?
Yeah.
Okay, so you gave the example, you said the Canaanites, it's hyperbole. Well, there's many examples. It's not the only example, and there's specific numbers. So in Judges 12:6, the concept of the shibboleth is used. They say now shibboleth. And if they cannot say shibboleth, for they could not frame to pronounce it right, then take him, and they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan. There fell at that time of the Ephraimites 40 and 2,000. And the context of this is they're at the river, and anyone who tries to cross the river to escape the slaughter of the Ephraimites, if they can't pronounce the word because it's showing that they're a foreigner and they're trying to escape with their life, these are basically non-combatants at this point who are just trying to escape, just slaughter them. And it also says to take their women as slaves. So this is the attitude of the Old Testament God. It does have mass slaughter. It does endorse taking all of those people as slaves. And later, just to connect this to the New Testament, Jesus does not oppose slavery. Jesus could be a Southern Dixiecrat and win an election and be beloved by the pre-Jim Crow law South. So I don't think that objection that it's just hyperbole gets you out of the problem that God is not great. He's a mass genocider.
Well, look, even if I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I'm that's just the response.
No, I was talking to her. I didn't want to interrupt her. Did you want to respond to that?
I think I'd like to, for anyone who's listening to this, if there's any Christians or anyone who's interested in hearing responses to the Old Testament atheist arguments, which I've heard more times than I can count on I've heard let's just say hundreds of times on these exact same arguments. Paul Copens has written a really good book called "Is God a Moral Monster?" And he does he very well explains exactly the context of those times, and he puts things into perspective. And so I would highly recommend that people turn to that book and for answers to those kind of questions when they're being challenged.
Yeah, all I wanted to say is so I'm kind of with you on that same boat, right? Like I've heard tons of the same arguments come from fellow atheists and agnostics, and I'm not one for those arguments, but what I do find interesting is that you said with regard to the Nazis, what we should do is like maybe hide them. And when I say this, I'm deadly serious. Why would your response to that not just be that, but also pray and make sure it wasn't God who commanded it? Right? Because ultimately what you're saying is you look at, I don't care whether God killed all of the Amalekites or just one. To me, it's not about quantity. It's not about quantity. The question is, the God who is proposed to be omnibenevolent, does he in fact kill only according to his own character and nature? And if he does, in what way could it possibly be justified other than saying God is God? Do you see sort of the hang up that I have here?
It's if people wonder, then they question God's sovereignty quite a bit, but there's something very interesting with humans. We're not going to live any more than about 100 years here. So no matter what, essentially, someone might make the argument eventually that, hey, wait a second, God's going to make sure our lives end at some point. Well, everyone's life's going to end at some point. That's sort of how we are. We're not guaranteed that we're going to live longer than 20 years or 10 years or 5 years. It's just really what God has decided is appropriate. And he's the one who actually has a lens that can look way into the future and see what the impact of all people, every single person is. And so he knows at which point it makes the most sense for someone's life to end and which point it makes the most sense for people's life to continue. And sometimes some of the things that we see, and I've seen today, are horrific. I mean, I can't stand when I see pictures of little babies who are suffering, or I see cancer patients who are children, or that kind of thing. I hate that. I don't understand why life is so difficult for so many people, and particularly difficult when I see it's really hard to see that, especially with children. And it doesn't make sense to me, but I also have to turn to God and trust him and trust his knowledge of the future, and that it'll all work out in the end, and that he's got a plan, and I need to sit back and not try to judge him. And going back to the Nazis, that is probably one of the worst wars. The Nazis is the worst war ever. It was horrible. And I look back on that, and I've had to actually given this a lot of thought. I thought, now, why would this happen? Especially, the Jews are God's chosen people. Why did this happen to them? And it led me to think of something that was kind of a different thought that may be controversial in some ways, but it led me to think of what happened in 1948. Israel was formed. And interestingly, if you look in the book of Daniel, you'll see that there was a basic predictions that what's going to happen towards the end of the world, and it relied on the third temple. And so now there's actually people in Israel who are talking about putting up a third temple. There's a group who's even renamed themselves the Sanhedrin. So here, after thousands of years, this country that had been demolished in the year 70 suddenly is resurrected, unlike any other country. I mean, we don't resurrect countries like that. And so it made me think that the anger around the entire world at what had happened to the Jews, it led to giving the Jews back their homeland. And so I thought to myself, maybe that's part of the reason for God allowing some of the horrific atrocities of World War II, because he had this farther thing in mind. He had something where he could see how it was going to work out with the formation of Israel.
Well, look, to say that is ultimately to say then that God is limited and that he couldn't actualize a world in which gratuitous suffering existed and the rising of the third temple, which seems to be completely contradictory to the Omnis, right? And just real quick, I wanted to respond also to what you said about, the Nazis and, them dying in the Bible, the Sodomites and all that. It's not just that, right? In scripture, and this, that God just winks someone out of existence at a certain amount of time. If God is sovereign, according to what scripture says, and from what I've read in scripture, I absolutely agree with you, according to Romans 9, it's that God decrees not only their death, but the gratuitous suffering that might also come with it, right? So it's not just as if some girl dies, in an earthquake, God winks her out of existence. No, it's a little girl dies and maybe crushed to death under 2,000 pounds of stone and screams for hours until she dies. That's what's hard to believe, because if we see those things in the world, right? We see those types of things in the world. And then on the other side of it, you've got Christians like yourself or other Christians who will say, yeah, but God loves us. And I say, well, that seems inconsistent. That seems inconsistent to me.
Have you heard of George MacDonald?
No.
I know you've heard of C.S. Lewis, right?
Yes.
There's a really good phrase by C.S. Lewis. Now, number one, let me first agree with you. I hate hearing about those kind of stories, and I have heard about those kind of stories, and I've heard about little kids dying in tsunamis and being crushed by buildings. And there was a horrible incident recently in Bangladesh in the last few years where the whole building collapsed. It was a building that was providing stores like Walmart clothing. And so people were working, and they'd been worked pretty much to death, and they were forced to go in on the day that the building actually collapsed. A lot of women ended up dying, and very young kids ended up dying. And it just makes me sick to my stomach when I hear about that. So I definitely want to agree with you. And suffering is a major issue. It's that actually is the strongest argument against any sort of theist God who is a divine lawgiver. It's the strongest, most robust argument is definitely the argument about suffering and evil. So how do Christians answer that kind of argument is a lot of times we'll look at some of the things that people like C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald have come up with. George said, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in initially and starts sweeping the floors and starts putting in windows and that kind of thing. And at first you understand, but then it starts hurting abominably. And he actually starts knocking out wings and building new, a pool. He starts doing all this kind of stuff, adding additions into this house. He's making it into a castle because he wants to come live in it himself. And it's kind of, it's kind of equates to some of the suffering that some of us, all of us will be going through. There's no one on this planet is going to get off without suffering. And so we're all going to have some sort of suffering at some point in our lives, or maybe throughout our lives. And the idea is that we're being built spiritually stronger. And so if any of you guys, if you guys think about your lives and think about a time when you just had a terrible trauma happen, and it's happened in all of our lives, and then what happened to you and your spirit afterwards? Did it crush you, or did it make you stronger as a person? Did it make you more tolerant, more empathetic to other people? What did it do? And you'll realize that a lot of times that kind of thing that occurs to people, as long as it doesn't just completely break them down, a lot of times they end up being built back up.
Well, let me just switch gears here for a second. Someone in chat has said that there's a quote from you, Stephanie, saying that God gave Christopher Hitchens cancer because he was bringing people away from God. Is that true?
No, that's not exactly how I said it, but let me point out what year I said that. Can I say when I said this? So this is a person. There's a, and I don't, can you guys, can you tweet me the link on this chat so I can tweet it out, by the way? Because I don't have the chat up right in front of me. But
yeah, hang on a second. I'll get it for you.
In October of 2016, I was involved in a conversation with an atheist on Twitter, and we were having a back and forth. And again, let's recall the year. This is October of 2016. This is a very long time ago. It's kind of long time ago. Since then, no one's seen me say anything like this on Twitter intentionally, because someone quote tweeted it and basically
on Twitter, all the viciousness. I got to get on your Twitter. Plug the Twitter. I mean, it's a must read. It sounds like.
Oh, you can find. I'm at LEAD 1225. So if anyone wants to find me, but somebody quote tweet. I deleted the tweet. Now somebody quote tweeted it, screen captured it, did all this stuff, and keeps retweeting it out periodically to get everybody mad at me.
I gotta see it.
So,
I'm gonna
so
actually,
here's what happened.
Can someone directly send me? I'm gonna change my avatar to Stephanie's tweet. Actually, I wanted to more.
Yes. So I made a mistake. I've since retracted my statement, but people won't let it die. So you can see it's already now we're in 2019, and here again I'm seeing the same exact tweet being trolleyed out by the same people. So I'm just assuming. I mean, I don't know who's in the chat because I don't have it in front of me and I want to see it, but yeah, if you could tweet this.
I mean, the source is questionable. I mean, his screen name is Lucifer Almighty, so I think we can say
yeah, I've seen him in numerous chats.
He's obviously motivated and biased and bigoted.
But no, let me just explain the context of that Christopher Hitchens tweet. So what happened was I at that point, now I had never met an atheist. I shouldn't say that. I had never developed any relationships with atheists where I knew someone was an atheist. We talked about it, that kind of thing in real life. And so I got on Twitter in 2014 to try to share Christianity. And by about 2016, it was like all the atheists were finding me. And I would put hashtag Christian and that kind of thing. And they were all finding me. And so I didn't really know how to interact with them. I honestly didn't have any, and you saw how that also turned out when I talked to Matt Dillahunty in 2016.
Yeah,
it didn't work out well for me.
They look just like us, so it's
so I didn't know how to, and so one thing I was very frustrated because I noticed that a lot of the people who are atheists were all following Christopher Hitchens, and I thought, oh, well, this man, he's turned all these people away from Christianity, he's turned people away from Jesus. I had that frustration and that context in the back of my mind, and so then someone said something, and I said, well, maybe God had to put an end to his life because he was, he's convincing and driving millions of people away from Christianity. And so that was why I said that. I didn't mean it to, I didn't mean to say God gave Christopher Hitchens cancer. In fact, I don't remember exactly how I phrased that, but that was the context.
Exactly the phrasing. It's going to be my avatar.
Yes, sure. So, but yeah, they got me. I mean, they've got me. There's a particular person on Twitter who probably in the last couple of years, he's got hundreds of thousands of tweets, or maybe not that many, thousands of tweets, and probably 80 or 90% of her tweets are about me. And she's the one who screen captured anytime when I've made a mistake on Twitter. She screen captures stuff and sends it to everyone to make them mad about me. So
what's her name?
Oh, I don't want to give her attention. I'm sorry.
Oh, come on. Give her a shout out, please. Come on.
Okay. All right. Her name is Florida Line. And so if she's listening to this, which she probably will listen to it because she does follow me, but she's the one who likes to tweet everything that I do. So, and Florida you won't see it. No, I haven't checked her really recently. But last time I looked, I would say it was probably, and maybe it was in January, but probably going back, 90% of her tweets in over a 2-year period were about me.
Okay. I also saw a broadcast that you had where you're talking about free will, and that was really interesting. I do want to talk to you about that, if you don't mind. But before I do that, do you know who Darth Dawkins is? Someone is saying that he blocked you.
Darth Dawkins blocked me?
Yeah. Fred Gwynn.
I didn't know. I didn't think Darth blocked me. He was actually very nice to me last time I interacted with him.
Oh, okay.
No, who blocked me is somebody I met on what was his name? Brett.
Brett Keane?
Yes, yeah, Brett Keane. He blocked me.
Okay. Reason?
So I have no idea. It's really strange because he blocked me a while ago. I was on his channel. I was trying to befriend him, and that's where I met Darth Dawkins. And then one day he was saying something to me in direct message, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but somehow it led to him blocking me. And then he unblocked me at some point a few months later, and then I somehow was on a thread with him, and he blocked me again. So I don't know. He's a Christian, in case anyone's wondering.
You seem very objectionable. I can understand. No, just kidding. But Stephanie, so in free will, in this discussion that I was listening to, you were talking about with this guy some sort of contradiction between God's omniscience and us having free will. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which conversation that was with. Was that a Tony Murphy thing?
It was just like one other guy, and I don't even remember his name. That's not important. But anyways, it was a weird sort of definition of free will. What do you define free will as? Because you were using the definition, the ability to have done otherwise, I believe. Is that? It's kind of complex because there are a lot of Christians people take different views on free will, and Christians have different views on free will. My particular idea on free will is that we're free to do whatever we want within certain constraints. And so we have physical constraints. Like if I said I want to go fly out the window, I won't be able to do that. But we have certain constraints, but we're able to do what we choose to do. And the idea of God's omniscience is he knows what our choices are going to be because he's concurrently in our past, present, and future. And so he can see exactly how we're going to live out our lives and the choices that we're going to make.
because again, he's outside of time. He's what they call transcendent. So that means he's outside of time, but he's also within time. He's also imminent. So so that's how that works out.
That seems like there's a problem with that statement, because outside is a spatial temporal notion, and so to say outside of time, I think, doesn't make any sense.
Well, let me if I go back to, like, if I'll bring out the, and I'm sure you've heard it and you guys probably won't like it, but I'll bring out the old cosmological argument, and it's looking at space, time, and matter had a beginning about 13.8 billion years ago. So the idea is something preceded.
The Big Bang had a beginning 13.
Right. Right, exactly. And so the idea is what preceded that. And so what had to precede that must have been something that was immaterial, outside of space and outside of time. And so the Christian answer for that is that's the Lord.
Don't know about that one. Why does that have to be the case, Stephanie?
What had to precede space, time, and matter had to be without space, without time, and without matter. Without time is an eternal being. So the idea is that God is, because what else could have come before that? If just think about this. No, I'm not going to. I won't use the argument from experience. The problem. I know, I got the argument from ignorance. All right, just let me put it this way. Let me just put it this way. So that is just, actually, a lot of people think that that's one of the strongest arguments in support of God. So it's not an argument in support of the Christian God, by the way. It's just an argument supporting an omniscient, all-powerful God.
You're not referring to the Kalam, right?
Correct. Yeah, the Kalam.
Well, the Kalam doesn't even conclude with a God. It just concludes with like a first mover. And omniscience, none of those omni properties are entailed in the argument. At least not the one that, unless you have some sort of proprietary version, which I'd be willing to hear.
I think arguing on God's properties is difficult using a single argument like the cosmological argument. I think that I try to take a lot of arguments together, put them together, and come up with what God's properties are. And so, yes, the cosmological argument does give us some hints on, for example, his intentionality, and that rules out the idea of pantheism, where it would basically is God's passive and imminent according to pantheism and part of this world, but not external to it. So it does rule out certain other gods in the planet.
Tell us how that works. How do you rule that out?
Because if we know that the Big Bang has a start date, and we know that what had to precede it had to be without the same characteristics of what came after it. So what preceded it have to be without space, time, or matter. And so, and what preceded it obviously had intentionality in that the Big Bang had a start date. You know, there was some intentionality to begin the universe at that point. And so what's nice about the Bible actually is it's one of the, it goes against some of the Hindu texts, for example, on explaining the start of our world.
So are you saying that the
hold on? Do you mind if I ask questions about the intentionality thing? Because like one of the things with explanations that appeal to the intentions of someone is you could totally do them. Like God intended to create the universe, and that's what the Kalam speaks to. But the thing with the explanations that appeal to intentions is we have background experience with the intentions of humans who create things and stuff. So we could do that. We could appeal to their intentions to explain their actions. But it doesn't seem like we have any background experience with God's intentions. So I don't understand how you can explain, the Big Bang as being an action that God intended. God intended to create the universe if you don't have background experience with his intentions at all.
So I think it's not that I don't have background experience with his intentions. I think that the Bible gives us some very good clues on God's intentions in a lot of different matters. And so I would just say that
the Bible, though.
Yeah, God directed the Bible. Absolutely.
Well, the thing is that we're trying to access his intentions without just going with his word. Otherwise, it's going to be begging the question. Right? I mean, God wrote the Bible, so if someone tries to ask you, how can you properly interpret the Bible? You can't just say, well, read what the Bible says, right? You see how that's a problem?
Actually, that's how it's funny you say that, because in one of our preachers at our church, he always says, how do you learn more about the Bible? He said, well, go to the Bible. And when you try to figure out a passage or something that's a phrase or a difficult issue that's in the Bible, you actually look to the Bible for other answers in different parts of it. So actually, I like that you said that, because it reminds me of that.
Well, my concern is, we're trying to say that we know what God intended to do. He intended.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that
Okay.
Here's what I'm saying. I'm distinguishing in either active divine force versus a passive divine force. And I would make the argument that because there's a start date to the universe, that gives support to the active force. And so even Einstein actually understood some of the theological implications of the Big Bang. And so that's one of the reasons why initially he was very sort of not against it, but I can say that he was very hesitant about supporting the Big Bang.
So let's
but I don't understand that, though, because it seems like people who are agents who do active things can also be passive. So without knowing, God's reasons, his intentions, how can you say that, like, just the fact that the universe was created means that it's the product of an active being? Because God as a being could also be passive, but you don't know.
I think it's what you're looking at
to be active. So
let me explain
to say that he chose to be active.
It's the idea of being active or passive. Someone could say I'm passive. I'm not using it in that way. Passive is a personality trait, but that's not the way I'm using it for this example. I'm distinguishing a passive Lord as being a passive God from an active God, in the way that the passive God or gods actually is something that it plays out in nature. So pantheists actually believe in a passive God that's part of nature. So everything you look outside and you see trees and you see the ground and everything else is all basically one big form of God. And so that's the pantheist belief. So I'm saying, and there's with pantheists, they think that life is reincarnated. They think that they're going to die and they're going to come back in a different life form, depending on exactly how they live their lives here. If they're punished, they're going to come back in a lower life form. If they're rewarded, they're going to come back in a higher life form. So they believe there's this whole sort of a mind behind a lot of the universe, but they don't think that, it's not an active mind, and it's not something that they can understand or ever have any responses to. But they also believe that there's no start date. So that's how that can actually be ruled out as a belief system.
So I'm fine with just saying pantheists are silly. Like, I'm not really I don't know anything about the way that I was understanding passive and active is the actions, because we're saying that God is an agent and God created the universe. And so that's an action. And the way that we can use that as an explanation for why something was designed, something was created, is we appeal to the intentions of the agent that performed the action. But you said there's a link to God's intentionality that we can appeal to, but I don't understand what that link is without, again, just appealing to what the Bible says. But then that's begging the question.
A lot of people say, and this is actually one of the atheists, and I think this might be speaking to kind of where you're going here. I think one thing you're going to is people say, oh, Christians think that the universe was made just for them. Oh, isn't that special? We're on this little planet, third rock from the sun in the Milky Way galaxy. It's like, it's all about us. And so they say Christians are so arrogant to think that it's all about us. But why are we here? Why did the earth overcome in statistically miraculous ways the odds against being in 10 habitable zones? Why do we have a moon the exact size it is? Why is Jupiter exactly where it is? The positioning of this planet actually led a lot of people like Hugh Ross and Sarah Selviander, who are two Christian scientists, to Christianity, because they actually looked at the overwhelming odds that we've overcome. And they looked at people like Leonard Susskind and others who have studied that stuff at length. And even Hugh Ross himself has studied a lot of that stuff at length. And so what I'm trying to say is, we don't all know God's intentionalities. I truly don't understand. Is there life on another planet? I don't know. How would that play out if there were life on another planet? No idea. But that's just so there are some questions, there are some unanswered questions out there. I'm not sure if it's all about us. I don't want to make that argument because maybe it's, what if there is another planet? So you never know.
Yeah, I don't know how accessible the interpretation argument is going to be.
Yeah, Tom, go ahead and just change the topic then.
Hey, you guys, I probably have about maybe 5-10 more minutes or so. Does that sound like it works? I know I started late, and I'm sorry I missed the 1 o'clock call. So.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, let me just ask you a quick question. When it comes to free will, why does an agent do X over Y?
Why does an agent do X over Y? So, like, for example, I'm not sure where you're going with that, because I would say, like, why did I get on the phone call today instead of continuing to study or read this Jonathan Haidt article I had in front of me, because I want to finish his article on liberals and conservatives. I find it fascinating. So why did I choose to do that? Well, I had to, a lot of times people will weigh the positives and the negatives. And so what are the potential positive outcomes versus the negative outcomes? So now I'm missing out on the research, but the positive outcome is maybe I can hopefully be a halfway decent influence to people who are maybe thinking of following Christianity, hopefully.
Okay, so I mean, we're talking about what it reduces to. So you can have a reason for this, and someone like who's a physicalist or maybe even a non-believer is going to say this is all going to break down, and it's going to come down to like neuronal, synapses firing, and your brain states and all that stuff. But if it all just reduces to that, then that's not really free will. It's just causal dispositions, right?
Yeah, I think you bring up something that we should probably distinguish here, because there's the idea of biological determinism, and that's saying that your cell structures, the way you were born, exactly what you're predisposed to do, is somewhat biological, and that's very true. I mentioned earlier that your personality is, about half of your personality comes from your parents. So those traits, a lot of times, if your parents were empathetic, you have a bigger chance of being an empathetic person. If your parents were a very jealous, angry people, you have a bigger chance of being a jealous, angry person. So a lot of that, you are predisposed in certain ways to do certain actions. God's basically stacked the deck, if you want to call it that.
Granted, I believe that we have predispositions to do things, but okay, that's set aside, right?
Well, yeah. So let me just
the rest of the decision making is accounted for by what?
By people themselves and the choices they make. So
and
I would say that it's the high level choices that are the important ones. Like, for example, when I look at biological determinism and I think about, walking down the stairs or walking around the house, there's some of these very routine actions that people take that are somewhat predetermined in a way. Maybe the action is exactly how you lift a window, or what you do. That's, how I pick up a phone, or how I learn to eat with a spoon, or something like that. But so there's these very simple, routine, non-complex actions that are probably even more determined than our very high level complex decisions. And so the high level complex decisions, now that speaks to the kind of stuff that I think that you're really interested in. And that's the decision, for example, to worship God. Very high level complex decision.
It has nothing to do with the level. I mean, you could talk about reaching for an apple or an orange. It doesn't matter. You might have a predisposition to eat the apple, but you choose the orange. And the predispositions being granted, you're saying that the rest of the decision is accounted by something, and it's not simply causal dispositions, right? It's not simply just a chain reaction of atoms and neurons firing. What is it? And if you just say you're just making a choice, that's a non-answer.
It's more complex than a lot of that. A lot of it is they've done neuroscience studies, and they've looked at people's brain patterns, and they've looked at that kind of things. And they say, people wonder, do you start off as a blank slate when you're born? And no, we actually don't start off as a blank slate, even though people have made that argument. We start off with certain predispositions to do certain things. As we grow, we fill our minds with more information and more learning, and we start to understand the outcomes of certain actions that we take, and we adjust our behaviors accordingly. So it's not as simple as to say the free choice of picking up an apple or an orange. It's looking at a lifetime of experiences and how those have shaped your decisions. And so that's what we're seeing a lot right now.
Right, and which could all be accounted for without a God, without free will, under a physicalist conception. So I'm asking you, what is it about your conception of choosing an apple over an orange, which excludes this kind of physicalist conception?
Well, I think that what you explain beyond physicalist conceptions is, I think, looking at things like our morals and looking at our values and looking at a lot of that kind of stuff. Now, I mentioned that values, and that's distinguished from the idea of duties, as far as one is what we ought to do and values are what we do. Values are also traits, and they are somewhat biologically predisposed to have certain values. But the question is, like, for example, that something that does transcend the physical is the idea of having these moral duties. And so in the fact that the entire planet has the same shared moral duties to do something right, be benevolent, be universalist, have self-direction. I like those ideas, follow care for people and not harm according to height. So that itself, just looking at that transcends the physical argument.
Well, I think that you reduced the predispositions to biology, which are physical.
Yeah. So if you were looking at to explain people's actions, if I had a statistical package and I was going to do a regression analysis and I want to explain your actions, I'm going to look at something they call variance explained on this regression analysis. And I would say that if I did an action and I actually had my personality traits put out there, the traits that I inherited from my parents put out there, all that kind of stuff, I would see, is there any incremental validity over and above what the predictions would be based on what I was predisposed to do for certain actions? And so you could actually map it all out. The idea is the outcomes and what we do in our lives are a function of a number of different variables, including our biological predispositions.
Yeah, but I granted all predispositions, and I'm looking for a mechanism. And what your experiment that you're proposing is not going to give a mechanism. Simply going to give a plot, a data point, right? So maybe, I don't know if you're understanding the question, but it's just a fundamental question about what it means to make a decision as a human being, right? Why does someone choose X over Y? And I think people want to say something like, well, because they chose it. Well, that's obviously a non-answer. So what can you possibly appeal to say why an agent chooses X over Y? I mean,
I just told you a lot of the brain studies that I just referenced, and I'll find some links to those that I can send to you. But one of the reasons people make choices is not just their biological predispositions. They make choices based on life's experiences and the way
that is part of a causal chain. That's part of a causal chain.
Right. Well, see, even looking at your idea of the mind versus the brain has these certain physical, characteristics, but it also goes beyond that. So there's also, the question of consciousness and that kind of stuff. So there are other things to think about outside of just the physical. That's what I'm trying to say.
So are you saying that the mind is exempt from causality?
No, I'm not saying the mind's exempt from causality.
Okay, so now we're back to an agent chooses X over Y because of a causal chain. And if you don't have an answer as to why that's not the case, then I don't know why you would say that we have free will.
Well, because we do have free will, and you have free will. When you got up in this morning, you decided what you were going to do. You decided if to take a shower or do any of that kind of stuff. So we have free will. It's just it's a characteristic that even people like Sam Harris has acknowledged.
I think that's tautologist, but everything that you just described is compatible with determinism. Right? So under determinism, if everything is just causal dispositions, I can get up and I can take a shower, and I can, quote unquote, decide to take a shower. right? I can do
No,
all of
I'm
that.
saying, see, I think that the problem with determinism, biological determinism, is it doesn't take it. They're trying to explain all of people's actions through our biology, and really that's not how the way the world works. We make different choices every single day. We're maybe more likely, or it's more probable, we'll make certain choices over other choices based on our past experiences. But it doesn't. We're not limited in making choices. So I'm not a supporter, by the way, of theological determinism. I don't think that very well explains what my understanding is of the Bible. So I don't think that God's predetermined our actions and we have no choices in the matter. I don't believe that. I think
Right.
that God is, he knows our actions, but it doesn't mean that he's predetermined them.
I mean, I don't really feel it fruitful. I heard you discuss that. I already know about that discussion. So I don't want to go that direction because it's already been discussed. So but I feel like I don't feel satisfied with your answer, and I feel like it's what you've said actually agrees with me more than anything. I mean, here's some things that some Christians might posit. Some Christians might posit that our actions are not simply determined by a causal chain, that the explanation for that is a random element, right? You could say that that's one thing that some Christians will say, right? Some Christians will say, I don't know what the mechanism is, right? But in order to have free will, you can't simply be just a result of a causal chain.
I don't, as I said, we're predisposed to do certain things. I'm just trying to, if you actually even look at a regression analysis, you'll always see there is an element of randomness in there. And so that's the error variance essentially. So there is that element. So I'm trying to say is God has stacked the deck. He set us up. He knows exactly what our predisposition is, but then he also watches us as we make choices through our lives. So it's a combination. It's like a full regression with all kinds of different variables in there. And so one of the variables is our predisposition biologically. The next variable is our life experiences. Another variable could be an element of randomness. So there's that.
Well, I think there's an equivocation there that you're making with randomness, because in your regression table, the randomness just refers to something that is not predicted or most probable under your model, right?
Correct.
When I talk about randomness, I'm talking about actual randomness. Like there is a randomness that has something to do with the mind, in which I am not simply, my actions are not simply just a causal chain, right? There is a random element which somehow gives me free will, but which, by the way, I don't think randomness gets you free will either.
I guess I don't, actually, that's probably not the best word even to use, but what I'm trying to say is that we have it's a combination. There's a lot of reasons why people do what they do, and you can't always predict how someone's going to act. So there's even books by behavioral economists that are really fascinating called Predictably Irrational. I mean, a lot of people you think that people will act in rational ways. There's some very irrational actions that a lot of people take, and scientists and economists have been making predictions about some of those. So it's some really good stuff out there. But the bottom line is that, there's a number of factors that influence why people make choices, and you're not forced to make any of these choices. So we know that it's based on a number of factors. So
can I jump in there? Because there's a misunderstanding. There's a misunderstanding. Like you're talking about regression and economics and like statistical factors or influences, like personality traits, right? But that's not really what he's been talking about. What he's talking about is a moment-to-moment brain state causality chain, which isn't like, what things are going to make you more likely statistically to like be altruistic, like in a priming experiment. We're talking about, if I had your brain states, I would be Christian. I would be talking to atheists and believing exactly as you believe, right? Like I would not have a choice to become atheist if I had your brain states. Now, when we talk about what causes A to lead to B to lead to C, when you say, well, you have a choice other than A being causal of B, causal of C, you're appealing to something. And when he said, in virtue of what? In virtue of what? you kept making statistical analogies, but it's not a statistical problem. That's like saying that, you know, if I push a button, you know, and it completes a circuit, it will fire probably. Like, it's not a probable thing. So if you look at the, you know, the trillions of synaptic connections in a brain, and you have a snapshot of those, like we do with there's a project called OpenWorm where we map out a very small worm. We have a complete simulation of the physical environment. We have a complete simulation of all the neurons and all the synapses. And the goal is to replicate everything the worm does, such that you could put them side by side. The virtual worm would be identical to the physical worm. That's the kind of causality we're talking about. And we're not saying that we have that yet, but we're saying in principle, since it seems plausible that that experiment would work, the human is a scaled up, you know, trillion synapse version of that. So in virtue of what would you have free will? And you said that Sam Harris believes in free will, but I think maybe you're confusing his like semi-compatibilist, like soft determinist ideas about non-coercion or unpredictability or something, which isn't the same thing as free will. Do you understand the question now? Like, what would give you the ability to do otherwise?
Let's go back to where I got the idea when I talked about personality traits and that kind of thing, because people always talk about nature versus nurture. And I think something you're getting to that we need to talk about is the fact that there could be two identical twins who are raised in different households. So when we study them, that's how we've determined that there's a certain setup. Now, do these two people do the exact same things through their lives? No, they absolutely don't. So they've shown that when you do have people who've got the exact same DNA, essentially, they end up doing different things in their lives when they're raised in different places. A certain portion, you know, a lot of them end up making some of the very same decisions. Like they might choose, they found in a lot of cases, they might choose the same sort of work. They might choose some of the same sort of people for wives or husbands or something like that. So they find that, but they also find there's differences in their lives. And so that just shows you evidence of free will.
Can I say that you're not understanding, or I'm not communicating
properly? But I
really
probably should get going though, because I don't think I don't see this as being productive really. Oh, I think we're going down some, and maybe I don't understand what you're trying to get at, because I just, and maybe that's it.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it again.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it was nice talking to you guys.
Yeah, it was really nice talking to you. It's
okay. It was nice meeting you, Stephanie. Have a great day.
Can you guys send me a link on your thing?
Yeah, I put it in the side chat.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Oh, here it is. Okay. Thank you.
And I will read God is not a moral monster. Looks very interesting.
Oh, good.
And
thank you.
I am going to read all of your tweets with the Wayback Machine.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to go and check out your tweets.
I'm going to actually make a coffee table book about it, I think.
God, you're crazy. All right, you guys. It was good talking to you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Take care.
You too.
Well, that was fun.